Our third and final speaker for this session is Francesco Grigoli, Senior Economist at the International Monetary Fund and a distinguished researcher at Georgetown University. In his presentation today, Monetary Policy Perceptions, Channels, and Heterogeneity, Francesco will share insights from a large-scale survey that was actually sponsored by Idea Lab. Please join me in welcoming Francesco Grigoli on stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much for attending this last seminar. I really appreciate the fact that you're here, given that I'm the only one thing separating you from going home. So really appreciate the time. So let me shift gears in the sense that I'm going to move towards a more economics type of topic, monetary policy transmission. And I'm going to talk about this from a very causal perspective, one of the main key areas in which Idea Lab is investigating. So this is joint work with Oli Koibyong at UT Austin, Yuri Goronichenko at UC Berkeley, and Damiano Santri at the Bank of International Settlements. So one key issue when you look at monetary policy is that it's very difficult to understand its effects because it's difficult to isolate monetary policy shocks. That is to say, the individual variation that has to be exogenous in order to do correct inference about its effects on the final outcomes. Final outcomes can range from a variety of things, but typically it's thought to be consumption and prices. And this is one of the key difficulties. There is another one, that monetary policy operates through different channels. It operates through a substitution channel, it operates through an income channel, it affects wages, employment, stock prices, house prices. So each of these channels account for a different contribution. And when you look at the channels together, it's very difficult to disentangle them. And last but not least, effects of monetary policy are wildly heterogeneous across people. There is a literature in economics that lasted many years that was using this representative agent model, so everybody was the same. There was a representative agent to understand the effects of monetary policy. Progressively moved towards a two-agent neo-Keynesian models, which basically assume some differences across two types of agents. And more recently, there has been a huge literature trying to understand the effects across a continuum of agents. So the most classical type of difference that you see in monetary economics is that there are people that have a higher level of income, people that have a lower level of income, and monetary policy has completely different effects across these two types of people. But differences can also span towards wealth effects and other characteristics. So there is much progress on the theoretical side, these Hank models, heterogeneous agents, neo-Keynesian models, but very limited literature or progress on the empirical front. So that's where we try to make a contribution. So what we do is to administer a household survey to 25,000 residents in the US, and then out of these 25,000 people, we interview again 5,000 of these 3 months after. And I'm going to just summarize the key results. So a monetary policy tightening, that is to say an unexpected increase in the interest rates by the central bank, have different effects from what people think or what the theory would tell you. The theory typically tells you that when the central bank raises the interest rates, demand falls, there is an income effect, there is a substitution effect such that output goes down and inflation goes down. Now, what we find here, by looking at the reaction of people, and I'm going to talk you to basically lead you through the paper to understand why we find different effects, is that households expect consumer prices to actually rise following a tightening, because in their mind, what happens is that an increase in the interest rate means that the borrowing costs are going up. So they're thinking that inflation will be higher in the future. And therefore, and also another key difference is that we find with respect to the typical macro models is that when inflation is high, households reduce consumption. This is the opposite of what you would expect, because typically what people think, or what, if you want, the theory says, is that there is an intertemporal substitution such that people move consumption from one period to the other. So when interest rates go up, people think that future inflation will go down and they should basically shift consumption intertemporally. Now we find that actually the effects is contrary to the Euler equation, which characterizes this intertemporal substitution. Then, consistent with theory, we find that respondents expect higher employment and lower stock prices. Wage expectations, we don't find much of an effect. And finally, we also look at how monetary policy operates through different margins, and we find that households seek to basically try to look for deals, seek pay raises, and increase work hours, reducing the propensity to save, to repay debt, and refinance mortgages. So I'm going to talk very briefly about the data, which is a household survey again. 2 waves of the same survey, 25,000 people in the first one about a year ago, 5,000 people in the second one, and these 5,000 people are part of the same 27,000 at the beginning. The survey is characterized by having 2 types of techniques. The first one is randomized controlled trials. So we are separating these 27, then after cleaning is 25, these 25,000 people into 8 groups. Each one of those receives an information treatment. And then we also ask some hypothetical questions. Always in this type of work, there is a trade-off between how many treatment groups you can have and how good you are at disentangling heterogeneity across individuals. So you really need sample size in order to look at these aspects. The first wave is going to ask about expectations of consumption, the intention about consumption. The second one is going to ask about actual actions, whether they actually consumed or not, in response to the information treatment that we gave them. We apply some cleaning criteria, which is pretty standard in the literature. We basically draw people that speeded through the survey, people that lagged, people that actually got distracted during the moment in which they were faced with the treatment. And we ended up with a sample which is broadly representative of the US population. So I'm going to first talk about the effects of monetary policy on consumption, and second, about disentangling the channels that operate in the transmission mechanism. So this is, in red, you can see over there the type of question, the type of hypothetical questions we asked. So if the Fed were to unexpectedly increase or decrease the federal funds rate by B percentage points, how would you change your consumption? Where we are randomizing the individuals across increases or decreases of the federal funds rate, as well as among the amount, 1, 2, or 3 percentage points. And then we estimate 3 types of equations without taking too much care about the equations there. The first one is really about what is the effect on consumption, right? The second one is trying to test what the macro literature is telling us, that actually tightening have a much stronger effects on consumption than loosenings. Tightening depress consumption, loosening boost consumption, and the literature typically finds that tightening works well, loosening not so much. So we allow for these asymmetries to take place in our equations. And lastly, we look also at the nonlinearities, whether monetary policy have sort of marginal decreasing effects when the rates go up or go down by a lot. So I'm going to just show you briefly the results over here. We find that indeed monetary policy tightening reduces consumption. This is very much in line with what the theory says. We also find that they are asymmetric. In column 3 and 4, you see that the monetary policy tightening decreases consumption. The stars mean statistically significance. It doesn't really happen for monetary policy loosening. So very effective in reducing consumption, not so effective in boosting demand again. And then we look at the nonlinearities, whether basically when the central bank intervenes by a lot, there are decreases in marginal returns. And that seems to be the case. As you see, the coefficients are smaller as you get to large monetary policy tightenings. Now, this is a very important part of the study, which is having a large sample allows you to study heterogeneity across individuals, which, as you might recall from the first slide, is very important when you look at the effects of monetary policy. And we studied heterogeneity along different characteristics of the individuals, but one stands out pretty uniformly, which is when the person has knowledge about what the Fed is, that is to say, what the central bank is, and this is tested with a very simple question. Do you know whether the Fed is a central bank or is a private bank or is an institution that take care about nature? So just very basic. and whether they have some financial literacy. If you isolate this type of people, what you see is that the shock of monetary policy is smaller. That is to say, they are able to predict better what the Fed will do, which makes a lot of sense. But once they receive the shock, the effects are much larger. So this seems to resonates pretty well with the overall idea that if you are a very smart guy that knows what the Fed will do, you basically are difficult to be surprised. But when you actually know how to move, and actually that produces larger effects. Now then we move, as I said at the beginning, we use hypothetical questions as well as randomized control trials with information treatment. This is the type of information treatment, one of the 8. And it says, as you think about your answers that you previously gave in the survey, please consider that the current federal funds rate is 4.6%, which is 1 year ago. And then we are going to ask in the second survey, that is 3 months after the treatment, to the same people, now thinking about the past 3 months, how much money has your household generally spent per month on the following spending categories? There is a list in the survey, we sum up, there is a total, we check the total whether it sums up or not. Point is, we estimate this type of equation, which allows for excluding people that had prior knowledge about the Fed, prior knowledge about the interest rate that the Fed is applying. That is to say, if the person knew that the Fed interest rate was 4.6%, it drops from the survey because there is no way to shock him. Basically, he already knows. So what we see is that, and keep in mind, this is very difficult for people because you are telling people to fill out a survey, you shock them with some information, you are testing 3 months after whether actually they took actions. So it's quite challenging to detect these effects empirically. Also, you have a relatively smaller sample size because in the second wave you have much less observations. But what we find is that actually there is some effect. And it's not actually asymmetric. The effect seems to be on both directions, especially for durable consumption. There seems to be actually more effect about negative monetary policy easing for overall consumption. Now, one key contribution about this paper, which is still ongoing, today's preliminary results, but one key contribution is trying now to separate the channel through which monetary policy operates. And let me just remind you, when you have an interest rate increase, the typical 2 channels through which it operates are the intertemporal substitution of consumption, moving consumption from tomorrow to today or today to tomorrow. There is an income effect, but there is also effects coming from your wage expectations, from your employment expectations. For example, if you think that your central bank is going to raise rates, you are thinking that maybe the employment will react in a certain way, your future expectations about what wage will do, what prices will do will change. And all these channels operate at the same time, so you need to come up with a strategy, an empirical strategy to disentangle these effects and associate a contribution on each one of them. So we do that by operating in 3 stages. The first one is to estimate the effect of an hypothetical change in the federal funds rate, not on consumption, as we did before, but now on expectations of 8 key variables, which sort of proxy the typical channels through which monetary policy operates. These are saving and borrowing rates, consumer house and stock prices, wage and unemployment rate. And then in the second stage, we use the information treatments. Now we have these all 8 treatments, and I think this is where also we do some methodological contribution, because we use, despite we already have RCT, we use an IV approach, an instrumental variable approach, in which we estimate what is the effect of these expectations that people have on consumption, but by instrumenting these expectations with their prior expectation before the treatment and with the shock that they received. So when we do that, we are able to recover then what is the contribution of each channel by multiplying the coefficient that we got in the first stage, that is the effect of these expectations on consumption, and the coefficient on the second stage, which is the effect of this expectation, of the federal funds rate on these key variables, and then the coefficient on the second stage, which is the effect of these expectations on consumption. So some results over here about the first stage. Now again, this is the change in FFR on consumption, an hypothetical change in FFR on consumption. And what you see is that basically is what you would expect, right? There is a pass-through to saving rates, a pass-through to borrowing rates. Consumer prices go up. Now, this is very much contrary to the theory, and this is, I think, one of our key results. That is, hikes in interest rate increase inflation. People think that when interest rates go up, inflation will go up, not down. And this is because people think that borrowing rates will go up. And if borrowing rates will go up, inflation will go up, because they need to spend more. So there is some sort of misunderstanding about how it operates, but hold on 1 second and you will see how it flows throughout. We don't have much of an effect on wages, and we think that this is because people think that there is an effect on unemployment, right? So if the unemployment go up, wages go down, but at the same time there is an effect on prices. Prices go up, so there is probably a balancing between the two. The rest is very much in line with the theory. Now, and everything seems to be pretty much symmetric, as you can see from the bottom portion of the table. This is the second step. So this is the results of this IV instrumental variable approach. Now, you are seeing here that actually inflation depresses consumption. So when you put these two stages together, you see that the final effect of an interest rate increase on consumption is negative, as you would think, but it's complete. The in-between is completely different. An interest rate increase for people increases inflation, and inflation, when it goes up, depresses consumption. So we were a little bit struggling initially with these results. So in the second wave, we tried to ask questions that corroborated the results we got in the first wave. And one of those was an hypothetical question, try to confirm whether people were reducing consumption expectation when inflation increases. And in fact, this seemed to be very much the case. So this is sort of one of the killer charts of the paper, if you want. This is pretty much a good decomposition of the channels through which monetary policy operates. You cannot do this through simple hypothetical question. Why? Because if you ask somebody, what do you think will happen, that when an interest rate increase, you are not able to uncover the structural parameters of their thinking, right? Because when you say to somebody, what happens when the interest rate increase, they are going to think channels, different channels, everybody has his own way of thinking about this, and these channels are interlinked among each other, so it's very difficult to disentangle. However, when you do this step of the instrumental variable that I showed you before, you are able to uncover the structural parameters and actually to compute the contribution and the predicted effect on consumption. So over here you have a very much large effect of inflation, which depresses overall consumption, as we said before, and the largest, biggest contributor are borrowing rates. So this is pretty in line with this sort of unconventional type of transmission. We also do the following. We basically compare, this is a simple bin scatter plot, the hypothetical change in overall consumption to the predicted consumption that we get through our approach. And you see that, I mean, typically you don't see much of it. Actually, there is a typo there. This is the 3-month ahead consumption change. That is a 6 to 12-month ahead consumption change. We know that the effects happens mostly there. So here you don't see much of a correlation. There is very pretty much dispersed scatter. But over there, that correlation is very tight. So it seems that our results speak very much to what is happening and what people are thinking when you tell them that the FFR increases. In the paper, we study other margins of adjustment as well. For example, here, through some hypothetical question, we are looking at whether people adjust through other margins. For example, are they going to ask for a pay rise when the interest rate increase? Are they going to look for higher paying jobs, to work more hours, to refinance their mortgage, and so on and so forth? And what we see is that things pretty much align with what you would think. A higher federal funds rate leads to more labor and shopping efforts. It's consistent with findings that households think that higher interest rates are linked with higher inflation and unemployment. So let me now just conclude by summarizing what we've found so far. So we found that monetary policy transmission mechanisms are very different from those that are typically in macro models, even in the most advanced Hank, heterogeneous agents, Neokeynesian models. Why? Because households, in our case, appear to anticipate borrowing cost when the Fed tightens the rates, which eventually leads to higher inflation. And higher inflation leads households to actually reduce consumption. So you have the same endpoint as in a typical transmission channel, but the in-between is completely different. Consistent with theory, we find that respondents expect higher unemployment, they expect lower stock prices, while the wage results are null, probably for the effects that I was telling you before, the balancing between the effects on unemployment and the effects on prices. We find that tighter policy prompts households to seek also other margins of adjustments, such as pay raises, better paying job, reduce the propensity to save, repay debt, and refinance their mortgages. Now, the next step of this paper, we have asked another bunch of questions in the same survey, in which we are also studying and decomposing how people allocate money across asset categories. So we will be able to basically have the same chart that we had before with the decomposition of the consumption channels, but in this case we will be able to say whether inflation contributes more to people moving their income or their wealth to stocks rather than bonds, rather than crypto, rather than saving, rather than deposits. And there is a final part of the survey in which we are also looking at the perceptions of people about how CBDC would influence monetary policy transmission. And this is very preliminary, so just for us to have a discussion, but what we see is that people are very much understanding the disintermediation that happens through a CBDC. So this is something that policymakers should really keep in mind if they are going to issue CBDC in a retail way rather than through an wholesale. So this intermediation appears to be a big factor. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience?
Thank you for this wonderful presentation. My question is about the conclusion that was when tighter monetary policy comes with all these subsequent behavior, where actually people are seeking for better paying jobs and moving from one job to another. In terms of the causal graph, isn't it this a collider? Because the Fed won't tighten the interest rate only if the inflation is very high, and only if the job market is quite tight. In the job market, when it is tight, people are like there is a pressure on wages, and people are hopping from one job to the other.
Yeah, I think this is the beauty very much of randomized controlled trials. I mean, what you raise is one of the main issues that the literature faces in monetary policy analysis, which is the endogeneity of an interest rate change to economic conditions. The randomized controlled trial with information treatment is a very powerful technique to avoid this type of issues, right? Because you are asking, basically the typical structure of this study is that you are asking people what they think interest rate will be. And then you let them read the treatment, and then you are asking them again what they think the interest rate will be. So basically you are able to compute a forecast error that you are going to use as your shock, but that is a truly exogenous shock. It's a shock that is exogenous to the economic conditions that prevail at that moment, that would instead be harmful for a typical macroeconomic analysis with aggregate data. I hope this helps.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I just wanted to ask, since the 2008 financial crisis till the COVID pandemic, because of the extreme quantitative easing, has the effect of interest rate regulation have an undesirable effect on how to control inflation?
So this is a bit beyond what I presented today. I can give you my personal view, which does not match the one of my employer at this point. That is very important to say. But No, I do think that monetary policy transmission is very much alive. And I think that in the post-pandemic period, you saw how that was pretty successful in delivering what is referred to as a soft landing. Economic conditions, basically the Fed was able to deliver a disinflation without destroying the economy, which is a very good result. That was not able to do that in other periods. And I think this is also true for emerging markets. In most emerging markets, there is this incredibly large improvement in policy frameworks and in the quality of implementation of monetary policy. Many emerging markets were very much able to, actually were very fast at tightening rates in the period post-COVID, when the economies were hit by both price pressures as well as a risk of type of shocks. So I think monetary policy is very much active.
Any other questions? All right, thank you, Francesco, for this insightful presentation. This concludes our breakout session A on our third and final day of the Adia Lab Symposium this year. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you all for joining us, and let's thank our speaker one more time. We will be taking a short coffee break and reconvene at 3:25 in this room for the awards ceremony. See you. Thank you.